He became king at 9 years old, was dead by 19, and ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth during the years in between. Tutankhamun wasn't Egypt's greatest pharaoh, but what happened during his reign reveals more about ancient Egypt than almost any other moment in its history. To understand Tutankhamun, you first need to understand what Egypt looked like before he was born. Because by the time he took the throne, the country he inherited was barely recognizable from the civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years before him. Egypt had been one of the most stable societies on earth since before 3000 BC. Along both banks of the Nile River, which cuts through the northeastern corner of Africa, farmers had been planting and harvesting in rhythm with the annual floods for generations. The Nile didn't just provide water, it provided a calendar, a food supply, and a world view. When the river flooded each year, it left behind rich black soil on the banks. When it receded, crops grew. When the harvest came in, temples received their offerings. Life moved in predictable cycles, and the Egyptians built an entire civilization around the idea that order was the natural state of the universe. That order had a name: Maat. It was the Egyptian concept of truth, balance, and cosmic harmony. Pharaohs didn't rule simply as kings. They ruled as living gods, intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Their responsibility wasn't only to govern people, it was to maintain Maat itself, to keep the universe in balance. Every temple constructed, every military campaign won, every flood that arrived on schedule was public proof that the pharaoh was fulfilling his sacred role. For centuries, this system functioned with remarkable consistency. Egypt expanded south into Nubia, east into the Levant, and accumulated enormous wealth through trade and military conquest. By the New Kingdom period, beginning around 1550 BC, Egypt stood at the height of its imperial power. Cities like Thebes and Memphis ranked among the largest and most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were being expanded continuously, funded by tribute flowing in from conquered territories across the region. Egypt's military was professional, well-equipped, and respected, or feared, from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia. Then, roughly 40 years before Tutankhamun was born, a single decision changed everything. A pharaoh named Amenhotep IV took the throne and declared that Egypt would abandon its entire traditional religion. The vast pantheon of gods, Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and dozens of others woven into every aspect of Egyptian life, was to be replaced by the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the disk of the sun itself. Amenhotep IV renamed himself Akhenaten, meaning servant of the Aten. He moved the capital city to an entirely new location he built from scratch in the desert, and he ordered the names and images of traditional gods chiseled off temple walls across the entire country. This wasn't a minor theological adjustment. For ordinary Egyptians, the traditional gods were embedded in every layer of daily existence, in the small amulets worn around the neck, in the prayers spoken before planting crops, in the rituals performed at the moment of birth and at the preparation of the dead. The priests of Amun alone controlled vast agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers, and wielded political influence that had rivaled the pharaoh's own authority for generations. What Akhenaten did wasn't simply change who Egyptians prayed to. He dismantled an entire social, economic, and institutional structure that had kept the country functioning for hundreds of years. By the time Akhenaten died, Egypt was in quiet but serious trouble. The new capital city sat half-finished and isolated in the desert. Diplomatic letters discovered centuries later at a site called Amarna, written by Egypt's foreign allies, show kings and governors sending urgent requests for Egyptian military assistance and receiving no meaningful reply. The army had been sidelined during years of internal religious restructuring. A pharaoh named Smenkhkare briefly appeared in the records following Akhenaten's death, then vanished almost immediately, leaving behind almost no trace of what he did or how he died. That fragile, disoriented Egypt, caught between an abandoned revolution and an uncertain future, was the kingdom waiting for a boy named Tutankhaten. He was approximately 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He would soon change his name, restore the old gods to their temples, and attempt to hold together a civilization his predecessor had nearly destroyed. What he accomplished in the years that followed, and what was discovered inside his tomb more than 3,000 years later, would reshape how the modern world understands ancient Egypt entirely. Tutankhamun became pharaoh around 1332 BC, inheriting a throne that sat on unstable ground. The first thing his advisors did, and it is important to note that at 9 years old, Tutankhamun was surrounded by powerful men who made most of the real decisions, was begin the process of reversing everything Akhenaten had done. The boy king's birth name had been Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten. One of his earliest official acts was changing it to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. It was more than a name change. It was a public declaration that the old order was returning. The capital was moved back to Thebes. The temples of the traditional gods were reopened. The priests of Amun, who had spent years watching their power and income stripped away, were restored to their positions and their estates returned. Images of Amun and the other gods were repaired on temple walls, where Akhenaten's workers had chiseled them out. The restoration stela, a large inscribed stone set up by Tutankhamun's court early in his reign, describes the state of Egypt at that moment in unusually direct language. It states that the temples had fallen into ruin, that the gods had abandoned the country, that prayers went unanswered, and that the army struggled in its campaigns abroad. Whether this was entirely accurate or partially propaganda designed to justify the reversal of Akhenaten's policies, historians still debate. But the message it sent to the Egyptian population was unmistakable. The disorder of the previous reign was over, and Maat was being restored. In practical terms, restoring Maat meant rebuilding institutions. The priesthoods needed to be staffed again. Temple economies, which functioned as a significant portion of Egypt's broader agricultural and redistribution system, needed to resume their operations. The military needed resources and direction after years of neglect. Egypt's relationships with its foreign allies, many of which had grown cold or hostile during Akhenaten's inward-focused reign, needed careful diplomatic repair. Two figures stood at the center of this restoration effort. The first was Ai, an elderly official who had served through multiple reigns and likely held the actual decision-making authority during most of Tutankhamun's time as pharaoh. The second was Horemheb, the commander of Egypt's military, a man of non-royal origin who had risen through the ranks entirely on the strength of administrative and military competence. Together, Ai and Horemheb guided the young pharaoh through the complex work of institutional reconstruction, while also positioning themselves carefully for whatever came after. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun himself was being raised and educated as a pharaoh. Physical evidence from his mummy tells a story that is both human and sobering. Analysis of his remains shows that he suffered from multiple serious health conditions: a club foot, bone disease in his feet, a cleft palate, and several forms of malaria. He likely walked with a cane. Over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb. Despite this, he was trained in chariot riding and archery, as pharaohs were expected to project an image of physical strength and military capability. Artistic depictions from his reign show him hunting, driving chariots, and engaging in battle. Though how much of this reflected reality and how much was ceremonial representation remains an open question. The court itself was housed at Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom, a city built around the massive temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor on the eastern bank of the Nile. Across the river on the western bank lay the necropolis, the city of the dead, where generations of pharaohs and nobles had been buried in elaborate tombs cut into the limestone cliffs of a valley that would later be known as the Valley of the Kings. Construction on Tutankhamun's own tomb had almost certainly begun early in his reign, as was standard practice. No pharaoh could be certain how long they would rule, and Egyptian burial preparation was a long, expensive, and highly organized process. For roughly a decade, this was the shape of Tutankhamun's Egypt, a kingdom in active recovery, administered largely by experienced officials, slowly rebuilding its religious infrastructure and diplomatic relationships, while its young pharaoh grew into a role that history would not give him time to fully occupy. Around 1323 BC, at approximately 19 years of age, Tutankhamun died. The cause remains one of the most studied and debated questions in Egyptology. Bone fractures, genetic disease, malaria infection, and even murder have all been proposed and analyzed over the decades. No single conclusion has been universally accepted. What is certain is that his death was unexpected enough that his burial had to be completed in unusual haste, and that the circumstances surrounding his tomb, sealed and forgotten beneath the desert for over 3,000 years, would eventually tell a story far larger than the brief reign of the boy who lay inside it. To understand what daily life actually looked like in Egypt during Tutankhamun's reign, you have to step away from the palaces and the temples and look at the people who made the entire system function. The farmers, the craftsmen, the scribes, the soldiers and the workers who spent their lives building, maintaining and serving a civilization that demanded enormous amounts of human labor to keep itself running. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers. They lived in small villages along the Nile, in mud brick houses with flat roofs, and their lives were organized almost entirely around the agricultural calendar. When the Nile flooded between June and September, the fields were underwater and farming was impossible. During those months, the state redirected labor toward construction projects, temples, tombs, monuments. This wasn't slavery in the Roman sense. It was a form of taxation paid in labor, called corvée, and it was how Egypt built everything. When the floodwaters receded, farmers returned to their fields, planting wheat and barley in the rich black silt the river had left behind. The harvest came in spring. A portion went to the state and the temples as tax, and what remained fed the family through the following year. This system had worked for thousands of years because the Nile was extraordinarily reliable, but reliability didn't mean ease. Life for an ordinary Egyptian farmer was physically demanding, nutritionally limited, and medically precarious. Analysis of mummies from non-elite populations shows widespread evidence of arthritis, spinal degeneration from heavy labor, dental wear from grain that was ground with stone and inevitably contaminated with sand particles, and parasitic infections from working barefoot in irrigated fields. Most Egyptians didn't live past 40. Many died significantly younger. The people who fared better were those who could read and write. Scribes occupied a privileged position in Egyptian society, not because literacy granted them noble status, but because the entire administrative apparatus of the state ran on written records. Tax assessments, land surveys, grain inventories, legal contracts, diplomatic correspondence, all of it required scribes. A boy from a modest background who gained access to scribal education could realistically hope for a government position, a salary paid in grain and goods, and a life considerably less physically brutal than the one waiting for him in the fields. Egyptian wisdom literature from this period repeatedly emphasizes the value of education, often in blunt, practical terms. Become a scribe, it says, and you will not have to break your back in the sun. Craftsmen occupied a particularly fascinating place in Tutankhamun's Egypt. The workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived in a purpose-built village called Deir el-Medina on the western bank at Thebes. This community is one of the most thoroughly documented working-class settlements from the ancient world, because these craftsmen needed to be literate to carry out their work, reading and copying religious texts, following architectural specifications. They left behind an extraordinary volume of written records on limestone flakes and pottery shards called ostraca. From these fragments, historians have reconstructed details of daily life with remarkable specificity. Records of worker absences and the reasons given for them, including illness, family obligations, and hangover. Accounts of disputes between neighbors, love poems, legal complaints about unpaid wages, lists of tools borrowed and returned. What these records reveal is a community that was simultaneously privileged and tightly controlled. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina received state-supplied rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and occasionally meat and wine. They had access to skilled physicians. Their tombs, which they built themselves in their spare time, were decorated with the same level of care and artistry they applied to royal commissions. But they were also closely monitored, rarely permitted to leave their village without supervision, and entirely dependent on the state for their food supply. When ration deliveries were delayed, as happened periodically during periods of administrative disruption, the workers stopped working. Records from slightly later in the New Kingdom document what may be the first organized labor strike in recorded history, when craftsmen at Deir el-Medina walked off the job and sat down outside the royal mortuary temples, refusing to return until they were paid. The tensions running through Egyptian society during Tutankhamun's reign were not only economic. The religious reversal initiated at the start of his reign had created genuine instability within the priestly institutions. Restoring the old temples meant deciding who would run them, and those decisions carried enormous political weight. The priesthood of Amun in particular had accumulated such extensive landholdings and economic resources over the preceding centuries that restoring it to full power meant, in practical terms, restoring a rival power center within the Egyptian state. Horemheb and I understood this. The careful, controlled pace of the restoration, gradual, managed, never fully ceding authority back to the priests, reflected a deliberate effort to rebuild religious legitimacy without allowing any single institution to grow powerful enough to challenge the throne. Beneath all of this, ordinary Egyptians continued the daily work of survival, planting, building, mourning their dead, celebrating their festivals, and trusting that the pharaoh, whoever he was, however young, however fragile, was doing his part to maintain the order that held everything together. Tutankhamun died around 1323 BC, and Egypt moved on with the efficient, unsentimental speed that political systems tend to apply to the deaths of inconvenient rulers. He left no surviving children. 2 mummified fetuses found in his tomb, both female, both premature, are believed by most researchers to have been his daughters, born too early to survive. With no heir, the question of succession fell immediately to the powerful men who had been running the country from behind the throne for the entirety of his reign. I, the elderly advisor who had guided Tutankhamun through his entire time as pharaoh, moved first. He performed the funeral rites for the dead king himself, a ritual act that, in Egyptian tradition, carried explicit political meaning. The person who opened the mouth of the deceased pharaoh in the burial ceremony was asserting a claim to succession. I became pharaoh. He was already old when he took the throne, and he ruled for only 4 years before dying without a clear heir of his own. That opened the door for Horemheb. The military commander who had spent decades accumulating administrative authority and carefully positioning himself within the Egyptian power structure, now became pharaoh in his own right, a man of non-royal origin, sitting on the throne of one of the world's oldest and most tradition-bound monarchies. His reign lasted roughly 2 decades, and he used that time with systematic deliberateness. He dismantled what remained of Akhenaten's legacy with far greater thoroughness than Tutankhamun's restoration had managed. The city Akhenaten had built in the desert was torn down, its stones repurposed for other construction projects. Akhenaten's name and the names of the pharaohs who had followed him, including Tutankhamun himself, were erased from official king lists. In the formal historical record that Egypt maintained, those reigns simply ceased to exist. The period was labeled by later Egyptians as the time of the heretic, and the effort to make it disappear from memory was nearly complete. Nearly, but not entirely. Tutankhamun's tomb, small and hastily finished compared to the grand sepulchres of more celebrated pharaohs, was sealed and eventually buried under debris from later construction in the Valley of the Kings. For over 3,000 years it sat undisturbed while the tombs of far more powerful rulers were found, entered, and stripped of their contents by ancient robbers and later by European collectors working with varying degrees of official permission. The very obscurity that made Tutankhamun a historical footnote protected everything inside that chamber from the fate that erased the material legacy of almost every other pharaoh. On November 4, 1922, a worker on the archaeological team led by British Egyptologist Howard Carter uncovered a stone step cut into the bedrock of the valley floor. Within days, Carter had exposed the entrance to an intact royal tomb, something that had never been found before in the modern era of Egyptian archaeology. The discovery made headlines across the world almost immediately. When Carter made a small opening in the inner door and held a candle to the gap, his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, asked if he could see anything. Carter's reply has been quoted in nearly every account of the discovery written since. He said he could see wonderful things. What he could see was a burial assemblage of staggering completeness. Over 5,000 individual objects were packed into 4 small chambers: furniture, chariots, weapons, clothing, food, musical instruments, board games, jewelry, ritual objects, and the golden shrine containing the nested coffins of the king himself. The innermost coffin was solid gold. The mummy inside wore a mask, also of gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and obsidian, that has since become arguably the most recognized artifact from the ancient world. The contents of the tomb transformed Egyptology. They provided a complete picture, unprecedented in its detail, of what a royal burial assemblage of the New Kingdom period actually contained. They gave researchers direct physical evidence about the material culture, artistic conventions, religious practices, and daily objects of a civilization that had previously been reconstructed largely from tomb paintings and fragmentary texts. And the global attention the discovery generated permanently fixed ancient Egypt, and Tutankhamun specifically, as a central reference point in the modern world's understanding of antiquity. What the tomb could not provide was the full story of the boy inside it. His reign had been short, largely administered by others and officially erased from the record by the man who came after him. He had governed a country in crisis, surrounded by adults with their own ambitions, while managing a body that caused him daily physical difficulty. He died before he was 20, leaving behind no monument that can be attributed to him with certainty, and no military victory that carried his name. What he left behind instead was 3,000 years of silence, and a sealed door in the rock that, when finally opened, showed the world exactly how much had been lost every time a tomb had been found before his.